stories from around the corner
and around the country.
You're listening to All the Best.
Proudly supported by the Art Gallery of New South Wales.
You're listening to All the Best from FBI Radio 94.5. I'm Kwame Slusher. Before we get into this week's stories, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm recording from stolen and Gadigal land, and pay my respect to Gadigal elders past and present, and also recognize that the area where FBI Radio is situated, Redfern, has long been a place of storytelling, strength, resistance, and resilience for First Nations communities. You're listening to All the Best from FBI Radio 94.5. I'm Kwame Slusher. Can you think of a moment when things fell short of your expectations? A book or a movie you've been looking forward to? Maybe you've met one of your idols and wish you hadn't. Maybe it was something bigger. Maybe it was your own country. A conflict of values around democracy and justice. In this episode, we explore the gap between a citizen and their country. First, journalist Louisa Lim addresses how democracy has been changing in Hong Kong.
The thing that you hear, which for me is really the soundtrack to Hong Kong, is they have these zebra crossings, which are really noisy, which are always beeping, and everyone is always like standing, waiting to cross the road, and they're jabbing at the button for the lights to change, because that's what Hong Kong is like. Everyone's in a hurry. It's really noisy. It's really loud. It's just, in your face in every way. It's a sensory experience in every way. It's busy. I don't know if it is anymore, though. I don't know if it still has that sort of life. So when I grew up in Hong Kong, when I was young, it was still a British colony, but I was also reporting there after it returned to Chinese rule. We saw the British leaving, the governor, Chris Patten, sailing out on the royal yacht with Prince Charles and his sort of photogenic daughters all weeping. And these were the newspaper headlines. And then a new chief executive appointed by China, a shipping tycoon called Tung Chihua, taking over. And I think there was this sort of failure of imagination when it came to the handover, and maybe almost like a colonial mindset that we could only think about the end of the British era. We didn't really come to terms with what it meant to go back to China. And at the beginning, we kind of feared that the worst would happen, but in fact, it was still relatively open. And even after its return in 1997 to Chinese rule, there were a lot of street protests, and it really became kind of known as a city of protest. And, it was this almost like a place where things that couldn't be discussed and published and talked about in China were. And so there were these little bookshops where they'd sell books that were banned in Beijing. And so it was like this little kind of spot of relative freedom for many years after it returned to Chinese rule. But then it was this sort of slow process over the years where things began changing. One of the things that was really at the heart of Hong Kong was this really sort of open public space where, there were so many newspapers and political parties and a lot of debate and discussion and, a union movement, a really thriving civil society. And the national security legislation, one by one, these things, either they were shut down or they ended up having to shut themselves down because of the possible consequences. One of the really crazy things about these laws is they apply extraterritorially. So anywhere in the world, you can be found guilty of a national security crime. And what we saw was these bounties being placed on the heads of certain Hong Kong figures, lawyers, politicians, activists overseas. And we saw this really recently in Melbourne, where a lawyer called Kevin Yam, who lives in Melbourne, there were these letters that went out to people saying, have you seen this man? So, these are acts of intimidation. They're aimed at muzzling people, making them be quiet. Hong Kong is changing. It's not just the political changes, but we're also seeing that a lot of the old Hong Kong institutions are one by one shutting down or being shut down. And, they're tiny things, your favorite bookshop or your favorite, it's like my favorite fishbowl restaurant, congee restaurant, actually. My favorite congee restaurant recently. And often we see that happening. And so these big queues outside, people really saying goodbye to the places that made Hong Kong home, that made it home. And that process it really seems to be accelerating. So many Hong Kongers are leaving, and we're seeing these exile communities rising and building themselves up and pulling themselves up all around the world. But when that happened, I knew that I would not go back. And it's a really sad thing to be unable to return to the place that you think of as home. I think for me, it was a decision that I already knew that I would have to take in order to be able to be free to say what I wanted to say. It's just the way that it is. Hong Kong is changing. It's not just the political changes, but we're also seeing that a lot of the old Hong Kong institutions are one by one shutting down or being shut down. So many Hong Kongers are leaving, and we're seeing these exile communities rising and building themselves up and pulling themselves up all around the world. I remember I gave a talk and somebody in the audience said, what should we do? Us Hong Kongers in Melbourne, what do we now do? Another audience member stood up and said, what I think we need to do is that we need to be the very best in our field, no matter where we are in the world. We need to be the best. And I just love this idea that, Hong Kongers, they're resilient, they're smart, they're ambitious, they will rise. They'll rise and they will make their mark in different ways in different communities around the world and hopefully rebuild these little pockets of Hong Kong all around the world.
That was Louisa Lim speaking about Hong Kong. Louisa is a journalist and an author of the book Indelible City, Dispossession and Defiance in Hong Kong, and wrote and reported for the podcast King of Kowloon on ABC. More information in our show notes. In today's feature, we are hearing from Peter, a Hong Konger now living in Naarm. In his 20s, he joined the Hong Kong police force. He soon realized justice looked a lot different than he thought.
Peter had lived in Hong Kong his whole life. He thought of the city as most people do: wealthy, middle class, an international hub of finance. He signed up to be a cop because it paid well and it seemed cool. But after only a few weeks in the force, he was shocked to see a new side of the city.
For the first time, I saw those caged house, Cantonese gongok in the building. So you enter, you see the tenants is living in a cage. They might be sleeping, they may be resting. They're extremely hot.
Despite being known as Asia's financial hub, there were over 220,000 so-called cage houses across Hong Kong as a result of the high property prices for decades. These are extremely congested, small accommodations where you could have 30 people living in a less than 50 square meter apartment, sharing a kitchen and bathroom. They are also called coffin houses because the rooms are as small as coffins. In 1990, 7 cage house residents died in a fire, with another 50 injured.
Before joining the police, before seeing this, I always thought that Hong Kong was a wealthy society, say 4-member family, normally they should be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment, 3-bedroom apartment, and then I learned that a lot of people did not afford to have that kind of life.
Peter grew up watching many TV dramas and films about police. It's always been a big genre in Hong Kong. And he often found the police in these shows very cool, attractive, and more importantly, with a strong sense of justice.
The police dramas in the 90s and the early 2000s that I watched, they are mainly about young people. They are either looking for direction or they have some very strong personal motivation, personal reason. It could be their families have been victim of a crime or their family have been police officer.
Peter had always believed in the idea of justice. He was excited to join the police force regarded as Asia's finest.
There's no one from my family who are working in government or the police services.
Peter came from a privileged background. His father ran a business, and his mother was a housewife. He described his life as a typical Hong Kong middle class, and before joining the police force, he rarely needed to interact with them, except when he lost his wallet.
I haven't held a real full-time job yet, so when they are talking about the poor working conditions, for me it was a concept, it was a theory. It was just some obstacle for me to overcome. I was 23, I was in my early 20s.
So he applied for the police academy training. He was young, brave, feeling he could take any challenges. He's also smart with an overseas degree, allowing him to be trained as an inspector, a higher rank who managed entry-level constables. It was his belief that he could make the society better. Peter was patrolling on the streets. As he stayed in the job, he realized there'd be little he could do. He was only a police cadet, and resolving poverty and inequality of the 7 million people in Hong Kong was way out of his role.
When I saw that, I felt frustrated and quite upset because as a police officer, you did not have the resource to... So it's not your job to deal with the poverty in Hong Kong. It's not your job to deal with the social inequality of Hong Kong. But you are seeing a lot of poverty and social inequality. And then later on, I learned that this term called moral injury.
The longer he was a police officer, the more injustice he saw. Here's a warning. There will be some graphic recollections of death scenes.
I attended a lot of dead body scenes. I have seen bodies of various level of decomposition because there was a lot of public housing estate. There was quite a lot of elderly people living in their apartment. They live alone. Yeah, I still remember there was a site that a public housing estate. So let's say the deceased person was on 2nd or 3rd floor. Before I enter the gate of the building, I have already smelled. I still remember that some very helpful constables already passed me some Chinese incense stick. And then I learned that if there is a stench from a decomposed body and then you have the incense stick, that instantly you don't get to smell the odor.
Peter was frustrated. He'd joined the police force to help rid the city of injustice. But instead, he found himself witnessing injustice, only to clean up after it.
My officers were doing the inquiry, door-to-door inquiry. They're asking the people, do you know the resident of this unit? I think in particular in that instance, and then the people will say, oh yeah, that person is a little bit funny in the head, and then come out, say weird things, do weird things, and then we don't know where the families are. So we get those information. We can talk to the social worker about more about this person. What I did was, I inspected the body. You have to physically look at the body to satisfy yourself that there's no suspicious wound, and then take the pictures of the body, of the surrounds, and then you call what we call a coffin van to pick up the deceased person, and then lock the unit, notify the housing department, and then they will be doing all the cleaning.
It was in the early 2010s in Hong Kong. Mental health was still a fresh term there. Peter knew something just wasn't right. The society was poorly equipped to address mental health issues. But even within the police force, he was watching people burning out. He watched bullying incidents between police officers. He recorded that before he took the police academy training, the people he talked to had advised him not to join the police.
They were saying that the working hours is too long, the demands were unreasonable. You do make close friends, good friends in there, but people, the senior officers could be quite abusive, and harassment did happen.
It was time for him to leave.
I left the police force when I was 26, so 3 years of police services, a lot of extraordinary experience. I think for me it was a very big part of my life. I knew that the job has exposed me to a lot of stuff. It allows me to kind of know the society much better.
So he left Hong Kong, moved to Melbourne in 2011. Then, right after he left, Hong Kong changed. First, it was the Umbrella Revolution in 2014, where thousands of protesters marched against Beijing's rejection of democracy. And then, it was the 2019 protest to oppose the implementation of an extradition bill to China. The protest lasted for several months, with international human rights groups accusing Hong Kong police of using excessive force against the protesters.
In 2015, 2016, I think I was more affected, more impacted by that. Probably because I haven't left Hong Kong for that long, for 4 or 5 years. I still strongly felt about the cause for freedom, for more democracy in Hong Kong. And then probably back then, at that point, I think the police was still appear to restrain themselves.
Peter was confused. He knew people inside the police force had tough jobs. But why were the police against ordinary civilians just for protesting? He found the answer to this question in an unexpected place, inside the Australian Air Force. He joined the Air Force in 2018. He wanted to become a real Australian, and he thought this might help. In his training, he noticed something strange. He noticed how similar it was to his police training. Too similar. Both started early at 5 a.m. Both had steak, cheese, and biscuits as part of their diets. No rice or bowls of Cantonese soup. Their uniforms were all designed for people at 5'6" or above. They also did lots of physical training that cricketers will do. Hong Kong and Australia have the shared history. They were both colonized by the UK.
It's a It was a very Anglo-normative environment. Ranging from the uniform you got issued, it is designed for an Anglo-Australian person.
Eating that food, putting on the uniform. These were the moments that helped him understand his true role in the police force.
In Hong Kong, the working language in many law courts was English. And then back then, it felt very odd to me. The law court in Hong Kong was using a language that not used by ordinary Hong Kongers. How is it fair? We need to put things in context. The Hong Kong police is the police arm of a government that is not democratically elected, that is not tasked to promote the well-being of the people. And it's probably should not be a surprise to us that they are doing what their government want them to do. Although Hong Kong has the facade of it's very modern, technologically, in the financial market, it is extremely mature, sophisticated. These are all true. But it is not a democracy. It is not a truly free society. It is a highly manipulated society that serves the capitalism, and they do not care for the people. So if the police are not doing that, we shouldn't be surprised, right?
And when the news of mass protest in Hong Kong spread through the world, Peter was also following the updates closely. But as international media began reporting on the public outrage toward police brutality, Peter was not surprised.
Actually, if there's anything that I feel differently to the ordinary Hong Kongers is I was not surprised by the violence and the poor behavior displayed by the Hong Kong police. Because I knew that internally they are treating their own people very nastily, very abusively. But because of the restraint of the rules and the processes, not many people experience that. Probably unless you are an arrested person. But now, because they have arrested so many people that wouldn't get arrested normally, so suddenly that became more widely reported. But the tactics, how they harass arrested people, I knew about it. But before that, I think there was some level of social consensus that it is okay to treat criminals, to treat triad members, to treat gangsters, because they're bad people, right? So it's okay to treat bad people badly. But they are just treating the arrested people kind of similarly.
Back in 2019, then Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam responded to the criticism on Hong Kong police.
The Hong Kong police force is a highly professional and civilized force. I would challenge every politician to ask themselves if the large extent of violence act and all those petrol bombs and arson and attacks, really deadly attacks on policemen happened in their own country, what would they do? What would their policemen do?
So, what do you do when you realize the pathway you chose toward justice leads nowhere? Peter chose to make peace with his migrant identity in Australia, rather than forcing himself to become someone else.
I think before joining the Air Force, I was very keen to do things that is very Australian, to assimilate. But I think after the Air Force, I don't feel that urge anymore. I think I have done my fair share of Australianization program. I became more comfortable and confident to identify or to talk about or to live as just a Hong Konger in Melbourne.
For Peter, part of growing up meant accepting that his vision of how the world was had major blind spots. Spots that he'd filled with heroic stories from police dramas and propaganda from his British education. In Hong Kong, as in the world at large, wealthy colonists decide who gets justice and who doesn't. More frequently, for many ordinary people, it's not the big government or armed force that directly destroy your faith in justice. But often, it's some relatively small things that make you start questioning whether justice exists. Like being mistreated during the first job you used to be passionate about, or reading news about injustice, war, and protest across the world. That also happened to Peter, even after he decided to lead a peaceful life as a Hong Konger in Melbourne. On social media, he will share news about the Israel-Gaza war, First Nation rights, and also his hometown, Hong Kong. He also decides to share his story with us, even though he has to use the name Peter to protect his real identity. But for all their might, they hadn't taken Peter's sense of justice, and they won't keep him quiet.
Let's get rid of the dichotomy of either there's justice or there's no justice. And I think in my world, I know how important it is to speak the truth. I know how important it is to verbalize the issues in the society. I know that it is important to be very direct and open and transparent about issues. And I am aware of how important it is to use that right. I'm now exercising my right to speak my true story, to point out things that are ugly. And a lot of people don't have that right. And I think probably to honor those people, now to exercise this right is important.
That story was produced by Wing Kwong. The supervising producer was Lawrence Bull. Whether you're a storyteller or a story lover, tune in to All the Best for unique stories from independent audio makers from so-called Sydney and around the country. Catch our live radio broadcast on Sundays at 9:30 a.m. on FBI Radio 94.5. Listen to our podcast Tuesdays at 4 p.m. on allthebestradio.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. Subscribe now so you never miss an episode. All the Best is made at FBI Radio on Gadigal land in association with SIN on Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung lands and ACCC on Arrente and Warramungu lands. The All the Best editorial producer is Mel Bakewell, and Phoebe Adler-Ryan is our executive producer. Patrick McKenzie is our community coordinator, and thanks to all the volunteers who help to bring you all the best each week. Shining Bird composed our theme music, and Annie Hamilton designed the artwork. We're heard across Australia on the Community Radio Network, and were made possible by the Art Gallery of New South Wales and the Community Broadcasting Foundation. You can find our full archive of more than 500 episodes at allthebestradio.com. I'm Kwame Slusher. Thanks for listening.